The wind howled low across the blackened earth of Kagoshima, stirring the volcanic ash like the breath of ghosts. A lone figure knelt beneath the shadow of Shiroyama, his crimson-stained hakama clinging to his legs, his sword-driven blade down. Into the dust before him, blood dripped from his fingertips. Not just his, but the blood of centuries. Saigō Takamori, the last true samurai, faced the end with his back straight and his eyes steady. The rising sun behind him painted the sky the color of spilled honor. He did not flinch when the final shot rang out, but truthfully, he had already died long before that bullet reached him. The death of the samurai was not a moment, not a scream, or a collapse. It was a slow dismemberment, one law at a time, one insult at a time, one rifle shot at a time. And by the time the world realized what had vanished, it was already too late. Saigō had felt it years before, in the cold halls of Tokyo, where the Meiji officials spoke of progress in European suits, bowing not with respect but with calculation. The code of Bushido, once the backbone of a warrior's soul, had become a museum relic. Steel had given way to steam. Loyalty, once sacred, now looked naive. Japan, they said, must be reborn, but at what cost? The samurai, once the arbiters of justice and guardians of the emperor, had become unwanted echoes. Their swords were outlawed, their stipends erased, their place in society obliterated, and in their place, conscripts, peasants, merchants, foreign advisors in bowler hats. Saigō Takamori had stood by the emperor during the Boshin War, had helped crush the Tokugawa shogunate in the name of restoration. He believed in reform until it betrayed its soul. He did not fight to replace one tyranny with another. He did not fight for a nation that would silence its warriors, then turn to the West for validation. He had withdrawn from Tokyo not in defeat, but in protest. In his silence, he hoped the emperor would remember what had been sacrificed for him. But silence was not enough. The Meiji regime feared him. His name, his presence, even his absence, it all cast too large a shadow dot, so they forced his hand. The Satsuma Rebellion was not born of ambition. It was born of despair, a final howl from a dying world. Former samurai gathered around Saigō not for conquest, but to make a statement with their lives, since their voices no longer mattered. If Japan would modernize, let it, but not without blood to mark the transition dot in Kagoshima. The soil was still rich with the blood of past wars. Here, where ash fell like snow and the sky seemed always bruised with memory, Saigō prepared for the final stand not of an army, but of an idea. He did not write a manifesto. He did not declare himself a shogun. He simply stood, sword in hand, and reminded the world what dignity looked like when all was lost. As the imperial army closed in, armed with modern rifles and artillery, the samurai stood in armor inherited from their ancestors, wielding blades forged in centuries of fire and ritual. They knew they would die. That was never in doubt, but death was not defeat. Not if it could bear witness. When the final hours came, Saigō did not cower in the castle. He descended the slopes of Shiroyama with only a few hundred men left. There were no banners, no reinforcements, just silence, steel, and the weight of vanished centuries. A friend later claimed that when Saigō was wounded and could no longer stand, he took his blade and opened his own belly. Another said a loyal retainer finished the job. No one knows for certain how the final moment unfolded. Only that it was not the gunshot that killed him, but the age, the death before the death. When Saigō's body was found, the imperial troops stood in silence. Even they, his enemies, bowed, because something ancient had died with him. Something irreplaceable. In that quiet beneath the volcanic sky. As smoke rose from Shiroyama and the dust began to settle, a question remained unanswered. Can a nation truly be reborn if it forgets what made it sacred? The last samurai had fallen, but the spirit he embodied, the code, the honor, the fierce dignity in the face of inevitability lingered like incense on the battlefield. The bullet ended a life, but not the legacy. Not yet. He was a man torn between two worlds, one crumbling under the weight of time, the other rising too quickly on unfamiliar ground. Saigō Takamori did not set out to become a rebel. He was in his heart a loyal servant, Of the emperor, a warrior molded by duty, humility, and sacrifice. But history has a cruel habit of turning its most faithful sons into outcasts. Born in 1828 in the Satsuma domain, Saigō rose from modest beginnings. He was not of great wealth or high status, yet his sense of honor and natural leadership set him apart. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a quiet intensity, he earned respect not through arrogance, but through a deep, unwavering sense of right and wrong. His sword was never quick to draw, but when it did, it never wavered. The Satsuma domain was known for its fierce independence and samurai pride. It was also one of the few regions that had studied Western tactics and shipbuilding, recognizing early that Japan would not remain untouched by global tides. Within this crucible of pride and pragmatism, Saigō's worldview was forged: loyalty to the emperor, defense of Japanese spirit, and measured openness to reform. When the winds of revolution began to stir, it was Saigō who helped guide the storm. The late Tokugawa shogunate had grown stagnant, corrupt, and blind to the needs of the nation. Together with other leaders like Kubo Toshimichi and Kido Takayoshi, Saigō became one of the architects of the Meiji Restoration. He fought not for glory, but to restore the emperor as a true sovereign, symbol of unity and sacred tradition. And yet, the revolution he helped win was not the one he had envisioned. Tokyo replaced Edo. The emperor sat behind curtains, shielded by ministers and modern bureaucrats. Western advisors poured in, and with them came railroads, factories, conscription laws, and the slow erasure of everything Saigō had once believed Japan stood for. The samurai class, once the moral backbone of the nation, was now seen as obsolete. Their swords were banned, their stipends revoked, their values mocked as backward relics in the new industrial age. The very men Saigō had bled with were being cast aside, discarded by the very state they had built with honor and sacrifice. He tried to remain within the system. For years he served in government, advocating for moral reform, for justice to the common people, for a careful path forward that blended modern power with traditional soul. But his voice was drowned beneath the roar of progress. Corruption festered. The government grew arrogant, impatient. The soul of Japan, as Saigō saw it, was being sold for machines and treaties. He resigned. Not in anger but in heartbreak, but legends do not disappear quietly. Back in Kagoshima, he became something else, a symbol. To the disillusioned samurai, he was their voice. To the people, he was the last honest man in a world of betrayal. To the government, he was a threat. And so the lines were drawn. The paradox deepened. How could a man who had helped restore the emperor now lead a rebellion against his government? How could a patriot become an enemy of the state he had built? The answer lies in the chasm between a nation's heart and its crown. Saigō had always served the emperor, but not the politicians who wielded his name like a banner. He had never sought war against Japan, but when the soul of Japan was at stake, he chose to become its sword one final time. He did not return to arms lightly. Even as tensions escalated in Satsuma, his home domain, now filled with disillusioned former samurai building weapons and training in secret, Saigō resisted the call to violence. It was only when the government attempted to arrest him and crush the Satsuma movement preemptively that he made his decision. If peace meant betrayal of honor, then better to fall with dignity. He would become a rebel not out of ambition, but out of faith. Not out of hatred, but out of grief. The world would come to call him the last samurai. But that is a simplification, a romantic mirage. Saigō Takamori was not the last of his kind, but perhaps he was the last willing to die for what that kind truly stood for. He did not fight to restore the past. He fought so that the future would remember it, and that is what made him dangerous. Not his sword, not his troops, but his silence, his integrity, his refusal to be bought or broken. That is what turned a general into a ghost, a statesman into a symbol, a patriot into a myth. By the time the Meiji regime moved against him, they were not just hunting a man. They were trying to erase a memory, a mirror held up to their own betrayal. But myths do not bleed so easily. And as Saigō stood once more in the volcanic dust of Kagoshima, The weight of contradictions on his shoulders, he became more than just a man. He became the question Japan could not answer. What do you do with a hero who refuses to lie? The boy stood beneath the cherry blossoms of Satsuma, watching petals fall like silent snow. Their beauty was brief, their end certain. Yet it was in that fleeting grace that Saigō Takamori first glimpsed the heart of Bushido Nada's poetry. But as prophecy, he was born in 1828 into a low-ranking samurai family, in a land where pride was not measured in coin but in character. In Satsuma, the blade was not an ornament, it was a vow. And for young Saigō, that vow began early. His father, though not wealthy, taught discipline with quiet severity. His mother taught compassion through hardship, and from both he inherited a spine made of stone and a heart open to suffering. There were no great libraries, no elegant courts. His lessons came in the sweat of daily training, in the sting of bamboo strikes, in the silence after a wrong move. He was not the most graceful swordsman, but he was the most determined. He learned to endure, to wait, to strike only when it mattered, but his greatest education came from watching others fall. The Satsuma domain, though distant from the heart of Japan, was not immune to political storms. Corruption grew like mold. In the higher echelons of Edo, poverty gnawed at the countryside. Rice was scarce, taxes grew. And when the people bled, it was the samurai who often stood between them and the abyss. Saigō watched as older warriors, once honored men, were forced to abandon their code for scraps. Some sold their swords, some drank their shame, others took their own lives with silent steel. Honor, it seemed, was becoming a liability in a world that no longer rewarded it. It broke his heart. But it also steeled his resolve. He swore never to abandon his principles, no matter how sharp the hunger, how cruel the politics, how high the cost. He would live as a true samurai, or he would not live at all. He read the Analects of Confucius by lantern light, not to impress, but to understand. He studied Zen not for peace, but for clarity in chaos. He believed that suffering purified the soul, that duty gave life meaning. That death was not the enemy. Cowardice was. At 17, he earned his first minor post in the domain's bureaucracy. It was not glamorous, but it was enough. He was noticed. Not for ambition, but for his humility, for his incorruptibility. Even then, elders said there was something different about the boy with the heavy brow and the heavier heart. Then came the waves, foreign ships on Japanese shores. Commodore Perry's black vessels arrived in 1853, bearing smoke and steel and the open hand of Western Empire. Japan's centuries of isolation were coming to a violent end. While the shogunate scrambled to react, young men like Saigō stood at a crossroads. Resist, adapt, or be erased. He chose resistance, but with wisdom. Not the blind fury of denial, but the sharp-eyed caution of a man who knows both when to draw and when to wait. The samurai of Satsuma began to prepare. Modern weapons were smuggled in. Western tactics were studied. But beneath the powder and the paper, they held tight to the old spirit, the soul of Yamato. Saigō's star began to rise in this turbulence. He was sent to Edo as a liaison, trusted with secrets, consulted for judgment. But even as he rose, he remained grounded. He did not seek titles. He sought truth. He began to write poems haunting, sparse, full of longing for justice and sorrow for the decaying world around him. He wrote not as a rebel, but as a man trying to hold on to something precious as it slipped through his fingers. He lost friends to politics. He lost mentors to despair. Once, when falsely accused and exiled to the distant island of Amamishima, he lived among fishermen and peasants, growing vegetables with his hands, teaching children Bushido with sticks on the beach. He did not rage. He did not plot revenge. He waited. And he learned. There, in isolation, he met love, married a local woman, touched ordinary life, understood what it meant to protect not just an emperor, but a people. When he returned, his heart was deeper, his silence heavier. He was no longer a boy. He was something rarer, a warrior with empathy. That was the birth of Saigō Takamori, not in a single battle, but in 1,000 small moments of pain, principle, exile, and grace. He became the man who could lead an army and cry for its dead, who could kneel before the emperor yet refuse to flatter, who could be loyal enough to sacrifice everything and brave enough to walk away. Not all warriors are born on battlefields. Some are born in gardens, in silence. In exile. In every life he touched, Saigō left behind something of the old world, something fierce, something kind, something unshakable. The boy who watched cherry blossoms fall would one day fall like one. Himself brief, beautiful, and unforgettable. The island slept like a coiled dragon, ancient, proud, and undisturbed. For over 2 centuries, Japan had closed its gates to the world, a nation encased in ritual, steel, and silence. From the northern snows of Hokkaido to the southern heat of Satsuma, the rhythm of life pulsed to the beat of the Tokugawa shogunate, predictable, ordered, and unyielding. To the Japanese, the outside world was a distant whisper. To the West, Japan was a mystery and a prize. By the early 1800s, Japan was still very much a feudal society, ruled not by a singular emperor in practice, but by the iron hand of the Tokugawa shoguns who had kept peace through stratified control. Beneath them stood the daimyo, powerful lords who commanded their own domains like kings. Beneath them, the samurai warriors turned bureaucrats, clinging to the last threads of relevance in a world that had not seen war in generations. Then came the peasants, artisans, and merchants, silent multitudes carrying the nation's true weight. But peace was never perfect. It was an illusion held together by centuries of tradition and fear. Samurai wore 2 swords, but many hadn't drawn them in a lifetime. Rice determined wealth. Marriages were alliances, not affections. And the emperor, revered, divine, was little more than a ceremonial shadow in Kyoto, his voice muted by the shogunate's grip. Yet for all its rigidity, there was beauty. Villages nestled between mountains, shrines older than memory. Poetry, written on paper lanterns. Cherry blossoms that reminded the people life is brief, but it must be lived with honor. But storms never ask for permission. Beyond the sea, the world was changing. The West had embraced machines, coal, and conquest. Empires stretched their arms across oceans. China had already been forced open by British cannons. India bled under colonial rule. And now, eyes turned east toward the forgotten archipelago that refused to join the age. American, British, and Russian ships had begun to appear on Japan's coasts, black-hulled leviathans, steaming with smoke and threat. They brought demands, open ports, trade treaties, foreign diplomats. To the West, this was progress. To Japan, it was sacrilege. The shogunate stood paralyzed. If they resisted, they risked war they could not win. If they surrendered, they risked the wrath of their own people, especially the samurai, whose honor could not survive SUBJUGETIO and in the streets of Edo. Rumors swirled like crows. In the tea-houses, men spoke of foreign demons. In the mountain temples, monks prayed for divine storms like the kamikaze that once repelled the Mongols. But prayers could not stop STEAMSHIPS. Inside the imperial court in Kyoto, dormant power began to stir. Loyalists whispered, the emperor must be restored. The true ruler must rise. The old world, bound in rice paper and silk, was beginning to crack. And in domains like Satsuma and Shire, samurai like Saigō Takamori were watching, waiting, preparing. They knew that Japan stood at the edge of a blade caught between the pride of its past and the pressure of its future. The storm was not yet overhead, but the wind had changed. The leaves no longer rustled with peace. They whispered of revolution. Japan before the storm was not weak. It was proud, principled, and bound by ancient honor. But pride does not stop. Cannonballs. Principles do not halt trade ships. The dragon was stirring. Across the sea, the modern world waited impatient, hungry, and armed. The sea was calm, but the sky felt wrong, thick with an unseen weight. On a summer morning in July 1853, fishermen off the coast of Edo looked up and saw monsters. 4 black-hulled warships, spewing smoke from tall iron stacks, tore across the horizon like omens from another world. They didn't sail with the grace of traditional ships. They roared, driven by steam, not wind. Their cannons gleamed. Their flags bore stars none had seen before, and leading them was a name that would split Japan's timeline in two, Commodore Matthew Perry. To the Japanese, these vessels were Demon's Curifone, the black ships, no sails, no honor, just noise and power. For over 2 centuries, Japan had enforced Saigō policy of national seclusion. Foreigners were forbidden, trade was limited to a trickle through Nagasaki. Christianity was outlawed. The outside world had been reduced to rumors, maps drawn in ink and caution, but now the West had not come knocking. It had kicked down the door. Perry came bearing a letter from the President of the United States. But it may as well have been a cannonball. He demanded Japan open its ports to trade, to coal, to diplomacy. And if they did not, he promised he would return with more ships, more guns, and less patience. The shogunate was stunned. They stalled, they delayed. They claimed they needed time to consult the emperor, though the emperor had been a ghost in politics for generations. Perry waited only 9 days, left behind a copy of the president's letter, and sailed away with the confidence of a man who knew the answer would be yes. And when he returned the following year with double the ships, double the firepower, he received exactly that. On March 31st, 1854, Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. 2 ports were opened. American ships could now refuel. Sailors were to be treated humanely. A U.S. consulate would be established. It was a small opening, but a fatal one. The door had been cracked. It would never close again. For the samurai class, this was nothing short of humiliation. A once uncheckable world had been fractured in a moment. Swords were meaningless against steam. Pride was powerless before iron, and the shogunate, by signing the treaty, had surrendered more than just portsit, had surrendered legitimacy. In villages and castles, whispers turned to roars. The old way was failing. The barbarians had come, and the shogun had bowed. Across Satsuma, Char, and Tosa, young samurai seethed. Among them, Saigō Takamori. To men like Saigō, Perry's ships had not merely brought foreign trade, they had brought a reckoning. Japan could no longer afford to live in dreams of isolation. The West would not wait. And if Japan did not change, it would be conquered. But what kind of change? Who would lead it? And at what cost? The black ships had arrived, and with them a crack in time. There was now a before and an after. Before Perry, Japan dreamed in haiku and swordplay. After Perry, it dreamed of factories, guns, and war. And in that dream, a new struggle was born between old honor and new power. Between East and West, between what Japan had been and what it was being forced to become. The ink had barely dried on the Treaty of Kanagawa when the rot began to spread. Within the grand halls of Edo Castle, behind walls that once trembled with samurai resolve, the Tokugawa shogunate found itself paralyzed. The very system that had ruled Japan in peace for over 2 centuries had no answer for what had come ashore. The shogun Tokugawa Ieyasu, and after him his timid successor Isada, stood not as commanders of destiny but as spectators to collapse. Their authority, once unquestionable, now cracked with every foreign demand they accepted. As more Western nations arrived, Britain, Russia, the Netherlands, France, each demanded their own treaties, their own ports, their own privileges. And each time the shogunate complied. To the common people, this was betrayal. To the samurai, it was blasphemy. The once proud defenders of Japan now watched helplessly as their leaders bowed not to emperors or gods, but to men with brass buttons and smooth words. Backed by cannons. Within the inner circles of the Bakufu, panic spread. Like ink on water, advisors clashed. Some argued for accommodation. Others, like the venerable daimyo of Mito, cried for Sanji, revere the emperor, expel the barbarians. But there was no unity, only fear. And fear, in politics, is blood in the water. The shogunate tried to play both sides. It appeased the foreigners while pretending to uphold Japanese sovereignty. It proclaimed strength while negotiating from weakness. And all the while, famine struck the countryside, inflation soared, and rice riots broke out among the poor. The illusion of order was fading. Saigō Takamori, watching from Satsuma, saw what others feared to name. the shogunate had lost the mandate of heaven. The divine balance between ruler and ruled, between sword and scroll, had been broken. And what cannot protect its people has no right to rule them, but Saigō was not yet ready to rebel. Not yet. He was a man of loyalty, of duty. He still believed reform could come from within, that Japan could modernize without surrendering its soul. That belief, too, would be tested. Meanwhile, within the emperor's court in Kyoto, long ceremonial stirrings of revival began. The imperial family, once ornamental, now became a symbol of resistance. And whispers rose, perhaps. It was not the shogun who should rule Japan, but the emperor himself. Thus, the shogun stood not only against foreign powers, but against time, against change, and now against his own countrymen. Each treaty signed deepened the wound. Each concession confirmed the sickness. The shogunate was no longer a shield. It was a relic, and relics do not command nations, they collect dust. Until they are broken, the shame was not in defeat. It was in surrender without a fight. The Tokugawa had ruled Japan for over 250 years. But no dynasty, however mighty, can survive when it bows to the wrong gods, and behind every bowed head in Edo, a blade was being sharpened. It began not with a war cry, but with a whisper, a shift in the wind, a silence too heavy to ignore. Saigō Takamori, once a servant of peace, now found himself standing on a knife's edge. He had given everything to the cause of the emperor, the voice of heaven, the beating heart of Japan. And yet, the court he had helped in power was becoming indistinguishable from the one he had helped destroy. In Kyoto, the sacred halls of the imperial court buzzed with new ambition. Young aristocrats, once sidelined by the old shogunate, now wielded authority. But power once seized rarely stays pure. The Meiji Restoration, Saigō's dream of a reawakened Japan, was mutating into something else, a state obsessed with centralization, rapid westernization, and the erasure of samurai traditions. To Saigō, it was like watching a child you raised turn into a stranger. He had fought in the Boshin War to restore the emperor's rule, believing that loyalty to the throne would save Japan's soul. He had led men into battle not for glory but for principle. When Edo fell and the shogun surrendered, he showed mercy. When the new government formed, he accepted a post not out of vanity, but responsibility. He believed Japan could modernize, with dignity honoring the old while embracing the new, but Tokyo, once Edo, had become a city drunk on foreign light. Western advisors flooded the court. Samurai were stripped of their stipends. Swords were banned from the streets. Ancient codes of conduct were mocked as primitive. The Meiji government had stopped listening to its old warriors. It was listening now to bankers, foreign instructors, men with blueprints and ledgers. Saigō felt it in his bones. Something sacred was being lost. He resigned his post in 1873. After a fierce dispute over whether Japan should go to war with Korea, the government refused. Saigō, who had supported sending a mission as a matter of national pride and principle, saw this as cowardice. More importantly, he saw it as further proof that the samurai voice no longer mattered in the halls of power. He returned to Kagoshima, a haunted man, honor-bound but disillusioned. He opened military academies for former samurai, teaching Bushido and martial arts not to prepare for war, but to preserve something fast disappearing, the soul of a warrior nation. But Tokyo saw it differently. To the Meiji leadership, Saigō was no longer a hero. He was a relic, worse, a threat. His schools trained thousands of warriors, men bitter about their lost status, their stripped salaries, their vanished code. His popularity among the disenfranchised samurai terrified the government, and Saigō, bound by silence and dignity, refused to deny or inflame it. Letters were intercepted. Rumors flew. Was Saigō preparing an army? Did he seek to overthrow the Meiji state? Even as he denied it, even as he maintained a monk-like distance, the government grew paranoid. They sent spies. They plotted. And so the seed was planted not by Saigō, but by the country that once begged for his loyalty. They called him a threat, a rebel, a traitor. But in the mountains of Satsuma, among the cherry blossoms and training swords, Saigō still believed in one thing: A man must die with his soul unbroken. Honor, he thought, was not in victory or titles. It was in standing where others flee, in speaking truth when others whisper lies, in fighting not because you want to, but because your silence would be a greater betrayal. And so the seeds took root, not in politics but in hearts. Across Japan, former samurai looked south not to Tokyo, but to Kagoshima, not to government but to a man who never wanted rebellion, but would not run from it. Because sometimes loyalty demands you stand against what you once defended, even if it breaks your heart. Snow fell like ash over Toba Fushimi. A chill wind swept through the narrow pass, where old allies faced each other with drawn blades and heavy hearts. It was January 1868, and the Boshin War had begun not as a foreign invasion, not as a civil protest, but as a war among brothers. Samurai fought samurai, not for land or gold, but for the soul of Japan. On one side stood the remnants of the Tokugawa shogunate weathered, proud, desperate to preserve their centuries-old rule. On the other stood the imperial forces, young, idealistic, sworn to restore the emperor to real power. At the heart of this rebellion was Saigō Takamori, the man who had once served the shogunate with respect, now leading an army to end it. He did not relish the battle, but he saw no other path forward. The Tokugawa regime had ruled Japan for over 260 years in age of peace, but one paid for with rigid hierarchy and isolation. Now, with foreign ships circling Japan's waters, the old ways cracked like brittle armor. Saigō, once a loyal subject of that order, had come to believe that its time had passed. The world had changed. Japan could not remain sealed. And so, when Tokugawa Yoshinobu resisted surrender, the die was cast. The Battle of Toba Fushimi was not a grand clash of thousands, it was a war of symbols. Imperial troops, many from Saigō's own Satsuma domain, carried the golden chrysanthemum banner of the emperor. For the first time in centuries, the Son of Heaven was at war. Saigō led his men with calm precision. No shouting, no grand speeches. Just eyes that carried centuries of honor and pain. His soldiers, though fewer in number, fought with divine conviction. The shogunate troops, demoralized and fragmented, began to collapse. By the fourth day, Tokugawa forces retreated. Kyoto, once guarded by the shogun's loyal retainers, now belonged to the emperor again. The symbol of the old world had been broken. But the war was far from over. For the next year, Saigō's army marched steadily north, encountering fierce resistance from domains still loyal to the Tokugawa. Battles raged in Hakodate, Aizu, and Ueno, the blood of samurai stained rice fields, shrines, and city streets. Friends fell on opposite sides of the same war, bound by duty, divided by fate, and through it all, Saigō remained a towering figure not just as a commander, but as a moral compass. He urged restraint, he offered terms, he reminded his soldiers that this war was not for revenge but rebirth, that Japan must emerge stronger, not simply change. In 1869, the final holdouts surrendered. The Tokugawa shogunate, a system that had stood unshaken since the early 1600s, was gone, and what replaced it? The Meiji era, a new government centered around the emperor, modern ministries, Western dress, railroads, telegraphs, banking systems, a nation reborn in fire and steel. And yet, in the very moment of his greatest victory, Saigō found himself drifting into irrelevance. He declined high office. He refused lavish titles. He returned to his homeland in the south, not as a hero seeking reward, but as a man burdened by what victory had cost. He had helped win the war. But now, the war had no place for him. As the new government accelerated modernization, Saigō became a shadow, respected but not consulted, admired but avoided. He was too honorable to manipulate, too dangerous to ignore, and so he watched from afar. He watched the samurai class abolished. He watched Tokyo rise like a European city. He watched young ministers ignore tradition, language, religion. He watched Japan sprint into the future, leaving its past unburied. The fall of the shogunate had been necessary. Saigō never doubted that. But in destroying it, had they also destroyed something sacred? He had not fought to erase Japan, but to save it. Now, as he walked the mountain paths of Satsuma, training orphans and teaching Bushido, he wondered whether the Meiji state had confused rebirth with rejection. In victory, he had lost something. More than he ever did in battle, a homeland no longer his. A future not meant for men like him, and so the seeds of silence began to grow. Not in defiance. Not in anger, but in sorrow. The whistle of the first steam train cut through the morning. Fog like a sword through silence. In Tokyo, wires hummed above cobbled streets, and soldiers in Western uniforms marched to bugles instead of bamboo flutes. It was 1872, and Japan, ancient, proud, isolated Japan, had awakened as something else entirely. They called it the Meiji. Miracle. In less than a decade since the fall of the shogunate, the nation had undergone a metamorphosis so swift it seemed almost unnatural. Samurai in silk robes now wore European jackets. The emperor, once a divine mystery hidden behind palace walls, now sat on a Western-style throne, issuing edicts through ministers in neckties. Education became mandatory. Conscription replaced warrior heritage. The calendar itself had changed. From lunar rhythms to Western numerals, railroads carved across the countryside. Telegraph wires pulsed with light-speed messages. Banks, factories, stock exchanges, all imported, all imposed. In Tokyo, gas lamps glowed through the night, casting shadows over shrines and castles. The gods of tradition stood silent as machines. Roared awake. To the outside world, it was breathtaking. In Paris and London, Japan was hailed as the Eastern Phoenix rising, not in centuries but in years. Diplomats marveled, industrialists schemed. Western newspapers praised this unlikely island for civilizing itself, without the usual dose of colonial violence. But inside Japan, the miracle felt more like a dissection. In Satsuma, in Shiroyama, in remote provinces where rice still fed loyalty and the old code still held breath, men watched their world unravel. The samurai, once the living spine of Japan, had been unmade. Their stipends dissolved, their swords outlawed, their top-knots cut. It was more than humiliation. It was erasure. Saigō Takamori felt it like a wound. From his mountain estate in Kagoshima, he received reports, daily policies signed without his counsel, values traded like currency, temples torn down for government buildings, the warriors he had once led now polished shoes in cities that no longer remembered their names. He had believed in change. He had fought for it, but this was something else. He had imagined a Japan strengthened by modernity, not consumed by it. He had envisioned railroads beside rice fields, not over them. Telegraphs in use, not in place of thought. Discipline made new, not discarded. Instead, what he saw now was a panicked leap to mimic the West, without stopping to ask, what is worth keeping? In Tokyo, the ministers spoke of catching up with Europe. In Kagoshima, the people spoke of forgetting who they were. Even children once taught Confucian ethics. Shinto reverence and martial discipline were now learning Dutch, German, English. Foreign textbooks replaced ancestral scrolls. In the name of progress, Japan had begun to wear masks not its own. The miracle had a cost. And not everyone was willing to pay it. Many samurai, impoverished and dishonored, wandered aimlessly. Others became clerks, policemen, or teachers' ghosts in strange clothing. Some drank. Some joined secret societies. And some looked to Saigō, because Saigō, even in silence, was still the symbol, the last honest man. The one who had never sought power, but had always spoken from the soul. To them, he was the soul of Japan itself, unbending, unsold, the Meiji. Government knew this and feared it. They offered him titles. He refused. They offered him money. He gave it to the poor. They asked him to return to Tokyo. He declined. In 1873, when the government decided not to go to war with Korea, a conflict Saigō believed could restore samurai honor, he resigned all positions and withdrew completely. It was not protest. It was heartbreak. The miracle marched on without him. Steamships arrived from Yokohama every week. Foreign instructors taught at military academies. Women began to wear dresses. The emperor's photograph was printed on money, but in the south, in the shadow of volcanoes, something stirred, not rebellion. Not yet, but memory got a question that flickered behind every modernization decree. Behind every school built with foreign bricks. What is a nation if it forgets what it once was? Saigō did not yet raise his sword, but he was watching. And listening, and slowly, across the fractured body of old Japan, warriors began to stir, drawn not to the miracle, but to the man who had once led them to victory, and now might lead them again. It did not happen in battle. There was no clash of steel, no last heroic charge into gunfire, no glorious death to preserve the old way. Instead, the sword died quietly on paper, behind desks. In the echo of policy. In 1876, the Meiji government issued a decree, Heitere the Sword Abolishment Edict. Just a few strokes of ink on parchment, and 1,000 years of warrior tradition were reduced to contraband. Samurai were no longer allowed to wear their swords in public. The very symbol of their soul, the katana, became an artifact of the past. They called it reform for the samurai. It was annihilation. Men who had lived and died by the blade now walked through streets unarmed, indistinguishable from merchants and farmers. Their topknots shorn, their silk replaced with cotton, their titles forgotten. Where once they had been greeted with bows, they now received scorn or worse, indifference. Their names carried no weight. Their legacy, no currency. The sword had once been more than a weapon. It was inheritance, oath, ancestry. It represented honor, self-restraint, discipline, and death before disgrace. Fathers had passed it to sons, masters to students. It was drawn only in necessity, yet it ruled every moment of a samurai's life. To be denied the sword was to be denied identity, but now Japan had chosen a new identity, one measured in factories. Not bloodlines. The government spoke of a conscription army, open to all classes. It was democratic, efficient, modern, but to the samurai it was a final insult. Commoners in uniform, farmers wielding rifles, generals trained in European tactics by foreign advisors, and above all, orders given by men who had never known what it meant to live by a code. In Tokyo, the new elite celebrated progress. But in the rural provinces, bitterness took root. In Kagoshima, where Saigō Takamori had returned to seclusion, thousands of former samurai still gathered. They taught Bushido in secret academies. They kept their swords hidden in floorboards. They spoke of loyalty and honor in whispers. They remembered a time when the soul of Japan wore armor and bowed only to the emperor, not to treaties or trade. Saigō watched this transformation not with rage, but with sorrow. The government he had helped to create was now dismantling everything he had once sworn to protect. He had not fought the shogunate to become a servant of Western ideals. He had not bled for railroads and rifles. He had fought for a new Japan, but one that still remembered its heart. Now, even that heart was being torn out. Across the country, former samurai petitioned for aid. They begged to retain some recognition, some role, some purpose. But Tokyo had no need for ghosts. The sword was a relic. The samurai were an expense. And history, they said, must move forward. Some samurai accepted this quietly. They took up farming, opened shops, sent their children to schools where they learned German, chemistry, and English literature. But others refused to forget. The Ronin masterless samurai multiplied. Many turned to crime. Some became vigilantes. A few committed seppuku in protest, dying with the only dignity left to them. But most simply faded faces in the crowd. Broken men in a world that no longer needed them. The death of the sword was not just the end of a class. It was the end of an ethos, a way of being, a sacred rhythm of life and death. And yet, in Kagoshima something still lived. In Saigō, the fire had not gone out. His silence was not surrender. His retreat was not defeat. Around him the last loyal samurai waited not for restoration, but for reckoning, because if the sword had no place in the new Japan, then perhaps the sword would return to remind the nation what had been lost. ***, it was a war without cannon fire. No banners, no drums, no declarations. But it raged just as fiercely across schools, city councils, village markets, and the minds of a fractured people. It was not fought on fields, but in identities. It was not waged by armies, but by ideas. The old Japan had not died with the shogunate. It lingered in the hearts of those who remembered. And the new Japan, shining in telegraph wires, conscripted ranks, and European suits, was not yet whole. It was still unsure, still insecure, still looking over its shoulder at the shadow behind it. In that shadow walked men like Saigō Takamori. He had retired from politics. Publicly, he had stepped back from the Meiji court, but his silence echoed too loudly. In Kagoshima, he had become a living legend, a ghost of honor in a country that now paid in gold. Former samurai flocked to him, seeking guidance perhaps. Redemption, not rebellion not yet, but remembrance. They built schools called Shigako, teaching Bushido and the Chinese classics. They taught young boys how to wield a sword, how to live and die with dignity. Tokyo saw something different. The government, led by men who had once stood beside Saigō, now whispered that he was dangerous. A relic, a threat? Not because he called for revolution, but because he reminded people of the past they were being told to forget. The Meiji state moved swiftly. It banned the wearing of swords. It disbanded the samurai academies. It began monitoring those who gathered in Kagoshima. A quiet campaign, one of laws, edicts, inspections. A war of attrition on memory itself, but memory does not fade easily. It resists. In the markets of Satsuma, people still bowed to Tego when he passed, though he tried to live humbly. Mothers whispered his name to their sons. Young men recited the code of the warrior beside factory smokestacks and railroad tracks. In every shrine and village the question festered. Who are we becoming? The emperor still reigned, distant and ceremonial. But the men around him, Kubo Toshimichi, Kido Takayoshi, had become architects of a nation built for industry, not integrity. They believed Japan must become strong like the West, or be devoured by it. Their fear made them ruthless. Their vision made them blind. Saigō watched them with deepening sorrow. He had fought beside them in the Boshin War. Together they had crushed the Tokugawa and restored imperial rule. But somewhere along the way, they had lost sight of the soul they once swore to preserve. He did not seek power, but power kept finding him. Disbanded samurai arrived from all over Kyushu, some with swords hidden under straw mats, others with questions burning in their eyes. They did not ask for war. They asked for meaning, for a place in this new Japan, for a future that didn't shame the past. And Tokyo answered with silence. Instead, it kept tightening its grip. Spies, taxation, punishments, public humiliation of samurai holdouts. It offered progress like a blade offered to the neck efficient, impersonal, absolute. This was the invisible war. Modernity against memory. Steam against steel. The rifle against the soul of the sword. And in the middle of it stood Saigō Takamori, not as a rebel, not yet, but as a symbol. He bore no flag, he issued no orders. But his very presence unsettled the regime, because every breath he took said, "We are not finished, a storm was coming." Not because Saigō wanted it, but because the Meiji government had declared war on everything that made men like him who they were. They had abolished the sword. They had forgotten what it meant to draw it. They came dressed in suits, carrying books instead of blades. White faces, foreign tongues, imported manners. The government called them Oyatoi Geikokujin, hired foreigners. Engineers, scientists, economists, military instructors, and most troubling of all, teachers. They were the missionaries of modernity, and their gospel was reason, not reverence. Classrooms once echoing with verses of Confucius now recited European equations. Lessons on loyalty gave way to lectures on logistics, the sacred stories of emperors. And warriors were replaced by maps of Prussia and English grammar drills. Blackboards replaced scrolls. Chalk replaced calligraphy. And in the eyes of young Japanese boys, the glint of the sword dimmed beneath the glare of kerosene lamps, and Western science. The Meiji leaders called it progress. They said Japan must catch up or be left behind. That the samurai spirit could not power locomotives or build naval fleets. They hired Americans to teach agriculture, Germans to teach medicine, Frenchmen to teach law. They sent students abroad to Yale, to Oxford, to Berlin and brought them back with foreign diplomas and foreign minds, but in the old provinces in Satsuma, in Shiroyama, in the mountain villages and island ports, many saw this for what it was, not just education, but erasure. Fathers watched their sons mock the bow and praise the handshake. Elders spoke of loyalty, but their voices cracked beneath the weight of laughter. Bushido became a word for fools. To be noble was to be backward. To be honorable was to be unemployed. In Kagoshima, the schools Saigō had helped build were under pressure. The government discouraged samurai instruction. The state curriculum imported from Prussia promoted obedience to the emperor, but not to heritage, not to ancestors, not to the ways that had once held Japan together through storms and sieges. Saigō watched with quiet horror. The Meiji Restoration had been about restoration, had it not? A return to the emperor. A revival of purity, of unity. But this was not restoration, it was replacement. And the irony burned deepest of all. The very empire he helped resurrect was now erasing the spirit he had fought to protect. He did not blame the West. He blamed those who had opened the floodgates with no care for the soil. It would drown. In private, Saigō still taught the classics to young men who came to him. He read from the Analects, from the Book of Five Rings, from old poems that spoke of duty beyond life and death. His eyes carried sadness more than rage. He knew the tide was turning, but he refused to kneel before it. Across Japan, boys were being taught to forget the silence of the temple before battle, forget the final bow before the blade falls. Forget the names of ancestors who once died with honor rather than yield. In Tokyo, the newspapers printed articles praising the new Japanese, rational, modern, global. But to men like Saigō, it was as if the soul of the nation had been traded for steel and slogans. What is education if it teaches you to despise your fathers? What is progress if it empties the heart while filling the mind? The devil's education had come not in fire, but in chalk dust. And it left behind no corpses, only citizens who smiled in Western suits, unsure of who they were when they took them off. The war was no longer just invisible. It was personal. Asterisk. The letter came in the spring, sealed with the imperial chrysanthemum. But the paper, though official, might as well have been soaked in blood. It was not a message of honor, not of gratitude. It was rejection, cold, bureaucratic, final. Saigō Takamori, once the sword of the emperor, was now an inconvenience. He had been the voice that thundered during the Boshin War, the blade that cut down the shogunate, the general who led imperial forces into Edo with restraint, grace, and power. Without him, the Meiji Restoration may never have succeeded. Without him, the emperor might still be a ceremonial doll behind palace gates, and now, with the country restored, there was no place left for him. At first, the betrayals came slowly. His petitions rejected, his advice ignored. Cabinet positions filled with younger men from Tokyo, men who had never seen blood nor heard the cries of war. The circle around the emperor grew tighter, filled with bureaucrats and Western-educated reformists who spoke of railroads, taxes, banks, and treaties. The warriors who had made those reforms possible were no longer needed. Worse, they were a threat. Too proud, too tied to the past, too dangerous. Saigō saw the pattern clearly. He was not naive. The empire no longer needed loyalty. It needed obedience. He had proposed a simple idea: allow dissatisfied samurai to fight abroad. Let them seek honor and service beyond Japan, where their skills still held value. Korea, perhaps. A war to redirect the rage. A war to restore dignity. But the idea horrified Tokyo. War was bad for business. The new Japan did not need warriors. It needed workers, merchants, diplomats. His proposal was buried under endless committees. And soon after, the message was clear. Saigō's presence in the capital was no longer welcome. He left Tokyo in silence, returned to Keijo. No fury, no speeches. Only the quiet disappointment of a man watching the house he built remove his name from its foundation. In the southern hills, whispers began. Disillusioned samurai followed him not as rebels but as orphans of an era. Men without stipends, stripped of rank, carrying rusting swords and fading dreams. They saw in Saigō not just a leader, but a mirror. A final embodiment of what it meant to be Nihonjin truly Japanese. Not in clothes or contracts, but in soul. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the Meiji elite tightened control. Western suits, modern banks. A new conscript army trained by Prussians. The emperor still sat on his throne, revered, but his voice? It no longer sounded like Saigō's, it echoed with policy. Not poetry. What hurt Saigō most was not that the emperor had changed, it was that the emperor had watched all this happen and said nothing, the man he had bled for. The figure he believed. Divine, silent. Did he remember the battlefield at Togofushimi? Did he remember who rode at the front when the shogun's cannons thundered? Or had Saigō already become another relic like the katana hung on the wall, admired but unused? In private letters, Saigō's tone darkened, not with anger, but with sorrow. He still loved the emperor, he always would. But love cannot survive. In the absence of dignity, a nation that asks for your life must not spit on it when the danger has passed. He had given everything Tao. In the shadow of his own victory, he stood exiled within his own country. Not by decree, but by indifference. And that, perhaps, was the deepest betrayal of all. The winds over Satsuma carried the weight of history, thick with the scent of gunpowder past and dreams undone. These were not peaceful hills. They were wounds. And in every village, every tea-house, every hidden training ground, one name returned again and again like a prayer and a warning. Saigō, he had returned to Kagoshima quietly, but the land knew. The men who had fought beside him, the sons of warriors, the fathers of fallen boys from the Boshin War, they gathered, not by command, by gravity. His presence was a call no decree could silence. Satsuma was not just a province. It was a furnace. Here, the samurai had not gone quietly into the Meiji night. Here, the people remembered that the sword was not a relic. It was a vow, and they had been humiliated. Once the backbone of the imperial victory, Satsuma's warriors had come home to find themselves discarded, stripped of stipends, rank, and respect. Their children were taught arithmetic by foreign instructors while Bushido was mocked as superstition. Their swords were outlawed, their pride labeled backward. Their loyalty answered with Tokyo's laughter. The Meiji government had not merely changed Japan. It had severed it, and in the south, the cut still bled. Men came to Saigō's estate with stories on their tongues and fire in their chests. Former captains, teachers, even rice farmers who had once carried a blade, all shared the same grievance. We gave them everything, and they gave us silence. They wanted justice, that they wanted purpose, but more than anything, they wanted to feel Japanese again, not according to some Western blueprint, but in the old way. The sacred way. At first, Saigō said little. He was not eager for blood. He still hoped, perhaps foolishly, that reason might prevail. That Tokyo would see the suffering it had caused and correct its course, but the letters from the capital stopped. Surveillance increased. Tokyo agents were seen in Kagoshima's streets. Arms shipments were monitored. Military drills forbidden. The message was unmistakable. We do not trust you. Saigō had not raised a sword, but Tokyo was already bracing for war. The breaking point came quietly, like a paper cut that bleeds more than expected. The government attempted to seize the remaining weapon stockpiles from Satsuma. A preemptive move. To prevent unrest, they said. To the samurai of Kagoshima. It was an insult wrapped in cowardice. Saigō's followers seized the arsenals before Tokyo could. They reopened military schools. They resumed training. Farmers were taught to wield rifles. Smiths began crafting bullets instead of plows. The Satsuma rebellion had not yet begun. But its heart was beating, and all eyes turned to Saigō. He had not declared himself a rebel. Not yet, but rebellion was rising around him like tide around a mountain. Would he stand firm? Or vanish into legend, like so many before? His silence was not indecision. It was mourning for a country that no longer recognized itself. For now, he waited. But all of Japan could feel it coming. The South was stirring. The sword, once buried, was remembering its edge. The sea outside Kagoshima was unnaturally still, as if the gods themselves were holding their breath. Inside his modest home, Saigō Takamori sat beneath a lantern, its flame dancing like the turmoil in his heart. On the table before him lay two symbols of his fate, his katana, polished and ancient, and a sealed letter bearing the emperor's crest. He had not opened it. He didn't need to. He knew what it would say. Another condemnation, another silent threat, another demand to stand down? But how does a man stand down when everything he stood for is vanishing? The Meiji reforms had gone too far. Not just in policy, but in spirit. The Japan that had once breathed Bushido now choked on profit margins, loyalty replaced by ledger books, ancestral shrines raised for railroads, students raised on English, textbooks, and the emperor, his emperor wrapped in modern garments, speaking words written by foreign advisors. Saigō had fought to bring the emperor back into the sun. He had believed it was the will of heaven. But what now stood in the light was not the divine sovereign he had envisioned. It was something else, something ... hollow ... How do you rebel against your own dream? The voices of Satsuma were growing louder. Young samurais stood outside his door day and night waiting for the word. The old war veterans returned to sword drills with grim determination. Even the elders who had once begged for peace now said it plainly. The government is broken. Saigō's closest friends Kirino, Beppu, Murata, they pressed him. They are provoking us. They fear your name. If you do not lead, someone else will. But it wasn't ambition that held Saigō back. It was agony. To raise arms now meant war against Tokyo, against the emperor, against the nation he had helped to unify. The sword once drawn in loyalty would now drip with the blood of countrymen. And yet, what other path remained? They had outlawed the samurai not with weapons but with shame, made them relics in their own land, told them to trade swords for pencils, spirit for statistics. A nation may modernize its ports, its armies, its currency, but what becomes of its soul? That night Saigō walked to his family shrine. The wind whispered through the bamboo, as if the ancestors themselves stirred. He knelt, closed his eyes, and spoke not with rage but with sorrow. I gave them everything, he whispered. And, now I must take it back. The next morning he summoned his lieutenants. There would be no manifesto, no bombastic declaration of rebellion, only a march. From Kagoshima to Tokyo, they would demand redress. They would remind the emperor of his sacred duty. And if met with force, they would meet it with steel. It was not treason. It was grief in armor, a final lesson from a dying class. Saigō Takamori did not choose rebellion. He chose to protect the ghost of Japan. But from this moment forward, history would mark him a traitor or a martyr. There was no middle ground, only the long road to death. Asterisk. The year was 1877. The sun rose heavy over Kagoshima, but it did not rise over a peaceful land. It rose over a volcano of men burning with purpose, dressed in defiance. No banners flew, no parades, only silence and steel. It was not a war for conquest. It was not a war for land. It was a war for something deeper, something older. A war for dignity. At Saigō Takamori's command, nearly 20,000 samurai stood ready, many with nothing but their swords, their armor, and their memories of a Japan that no longer existed. They were relics in their own homeland. Men without a future, armed with honor. Their enemy wore modern uniforms, spoke in bureaucratic tongues, and carried Western rifles. But it was not rifles that would determine the fate of this rebellion. It was resolved. From Kagoshima, they marched north through the forest, their feet treading not just soil, but history. The old paths of the Satsuma domain wound around their hearts like a ghost trail. They were not soldiers. They were descendants of warriors who once ruled this land. And now they returned to die on it, if needed. The Meiji government in Tokyo had underestimated them. To Tokyo, this was a brief mutiny, a temper tantrum by outdated warriors. But as reports poured in from the south, panic spread. The rebels were not dissolving. They were advancing fast, disciplined, relentless. Cities that once swore allegiance to the emperor now whispered prayers for Saigō. Even peasants, long crushed by taxes and reforms, offered rice in silence, not out of loyalty to the sword, but out of memory of a time when honor held meaning. The samurai took Kumamoto by storm. There the old castle resisted. Government troops hunkered behind modern walls, bolstered by rifles, artillery, and foreign-trained officers. Yet Saigō's men laid siege, their lines unbroken even under fire. It was here the two Japans collided not on ideology alone, but in blood. Bullets rained. Cannons roared. But the rebels did not break. They ran out of food before they ran out of will. In the trenches, young samurai wrote poems before charging headlong into gunfire. I do not fear death, one carved into wood, only forgetting who we were. It was war without illusions. The samurai knew the odds, knew they were fighting ghosts with blades, but they fought not for victory. They fought to remind Japan that something was being lost, not in battle, but in progress. Saigō rode along the lines quietly. He did not give grand speeches. He gave presence. He gave memory. His silence spoke what no war cry could. We fight. Because we must. Because if we do not, the Japan we knew will vanish without a sound. And so the Satsuma Rebellion began not as a revolution, but as a requiem, a funeral march for the soul of a nation. One swing of the sword at a time. The sky above Kumamoto was gray with smoke. Not the smoke of celebration, nor the sacred incense of temples, but the bitter, choking haze of cannon fire. Below it, Saigō Takamori stood silent upon a hill, his eyes fixed on the stronghold that now defined the fate of his rebellion, Kumamoto Castle. It was March 1877. The rebellion had begun with fire in the hearts of 20,000 samurai. But this was the first wall, the first immovable object in their path. The castle loomed with stone defiance, encircled by thick walls and a modern garrison. Inside, over 3,800 government troops hunkered down, armed with rifles, Gatling guns, and artillery. They did not carry katanas. They carried the future, but the rebels carried something older. They carried silence, discipline, death-willing devotion. When Saigō's forces reached the castle on February 19th, the fields surrounding Kumamoto trembled not with fear, but with the weight of history bearing down. Here was where Bushido would face its reckoning. Here, the soul of the samurai would either break or prove unbreakable. At first, the siege tightened like a noose. Saigō's men dug trenches, severed supply routes, and cut communication lines. For weeks, no reinforcements came. Inside the castle, the imperial troops rationed rice and prayed. Outside, the samurai waited, starved, still, unmoving, but it was not stillness of peace. It was the stillness before the storm. On March 4th, the assault began. Rebel lines surged forward, wave after wave of men in lacquered armor, blades drawn, banners of Satsuma snapping in the wind. The imperial defenders answered with bullets. Rifles cracked like thunder. Gatling guns spat metal storms. Bodies fell in clusters, torn apart before their blades reached the walls, and yet they charged again. A young samurai, his name forgotten to history, was seen running into the hail of gunfire barefoot, shouting, "I would rather die as a relic than live as a machine." They never found his body. Inside Kumamoto Castle, General Tani Tateki braced for the worst. Ammunition dwindled. Morale withered. Starvation crept in like a second enemy. But still, the castle did not fall. Why? Because modernity, though still young in Japan, had learned from the West: dig deeper, fire longer, ration better, and never show weakness. Weeks passed. Then months. Rebel camps were soaked with spring rains. Mud became their mattress. The dead were buried in shallow graves, or not at all. Illness swept through the siege lines. Rice was gone. Salt vanished. And morale, once a roaring fire, dwindled to embers. Saigō, ever the stoic, remained composed. But within, the cracks had begun to form. The rebellion had been noble. But nobility does not feed an army. Then came the blow they could not recover from. Reinforcements for the imperial forces arrived. Fresh troops from Tokyo. Modern arms gleaming, rifles loaded with foreign bullets. The ring that had once suffocated Kumamoto now found itself surrounded. The siege had turned. The prey had become the predator. Saigō's men, now worn and wounded, were forced to retreat. Not in cowardice, but in futility. The siege, which was meant to awaken Japan's soul, had only proven how far it had already drifted. Kumamoto Castle never fell. The samurai did, as they limped northward through the forests they once ruled. A quiet realization set in. They were not losing a war. They were witnessing the death of an age. Saigō said nothing. But in his eyes, those who followed him saw it. This rebellion was not just against rifles. It was against time, and time, as always, shows no mercy. They wore no helmets, no camouflage, no epaulets stitched by machines. Instead, they marched in layered armor, lacquered and worn by time. Their swords were not polished for show. They were passed down by blood, sharpened by purpose. These were not soldiers in the eyes of the Meiji state. They were shadows of a bygone world. But to each other, and to Saigō Takamori, they were the last warriors of Japan. And now, these warriors were walking into hell. The Satsuma Rebellion had left its romantic beginnings in the misty hills of Kagoshima. What began as a symbolic revolt was now a full-fledged war, and the modern world was watching. Journalists from Europe scribbled in disbelief. Western military attaches followed the campaign, stunned at what they were witnessing, a feudal army, armed with blades, bows, and broken rifles, facing off against a government wielding imported artillery, steam-powered logistics, and war strategies taught by French and Prussian advisors. It was not a war. It was a clash of centuries. On the fields of Tabaruzaka, the rain fell in sheets. Mud swallowed feet, bullets sliced the air like unseen gods, and still the samurai came. They charged not in formations, but in brotherhood. They screamed ancient war cries, not orders. They carried letters of goodbye in their sleeves, already written, already signed. The Imperial Army drilled in the new ways, dug trenches, rotated units, and reloaded rifles behind earthworks. The contrast was painful. The rebels, though brave, often ran out of ammunition before battle even began. Some fired once, then rushed forward with swords drawn, as though time itself could be cut down with a katana, and sometimes it almost worked. A unit of 30 samurai charged a government line, their blades flashing through gun smoke. They reached the trench, they leapt in. For a moment only, a moment, rifles fell silent, and then it ended. Machine fire shredded their honor into meat and memory. 30 went in. One crawled out, but they did not stop. They fought at night with torches. They used the forests as shields. They sabotaged rail lines. And every time a samurai fell, he was not mourned as a casualty. He was celebrated as a son of Bushido. In this war, death was not defeat. It was confirmation of purpose. Yet even glory has its limit. The Meiji government, realizing the rebellion's persistence, poured more men and more guns into Kyushu. By the summer of 1877, over 60,000 imperial troops were mobilized. Trains brought ammunition, telegraphs coordinated movements. A modern nation was flexing its muscle against its own soul, and still, the samurai refused surrender. They knew the war was lost not in strategy, but in spirit. But that was never the point. Their rebellion was a poem written in blood, a final love letter to a Japan they would never see again, and Saigō, he rode among them without armor, without fear. Not as a general, but as a witness. As swords met steel rails, as flesh met gunpowder, he watched the old Japan die not all at once, but piece by piece, man by man. In every charge a tradition fell, in every retreat a memory bled, and in every grave a page of history was buried. A samurai army had entered a modern war, but modern war had no place for honor, only victory, only efficiency, only silence, and the silence was spreading. The morning fog clung to the hills like ghostly breath, refusing to lift, as if even the heavens mourned what was about to happen. Beneath it, men knelt in silent rows, sharpening blades that would never touch skin, whispering prayers to ancestors who could no longer protect them. They were warriors of soul, not science. Their armor rattled with the weight of history. But across the field, the enemy did not pray. The Imperial Army cleaned. Rifles, calibrated cannon angles, checked their powder, adjusted their new Western-style uniforms. Their war was one of equations, ballistics, supply chains, coordinates, and still, Saigō's men rose. Every inch of land had become sacred because it was paid for in blood. A stream became a graveyard, a farmhouse, a fortress. Every retreat was a wound to the soul. Every advance a miracle. The battlefield at Nobioka had turned into a furnace of steel and mud. For days, the sky rained iron. The Meiji artillery opened fire from ridgelines, launching shells that shrieked through the mist like banshees. Explosions carved holes into the earth. Shrapnel tore through bamboo and bone alike. Trees were ripped up by the roots. Men vanished in flashes of fire before they could even raise a sword, and yet they kept moving forward. A group of samurai broke cover and rushed a fortified outpost. Their sandals sank in muck. Their banners flapped, soaked in blood and rain. With only blades and pistols, they ran toward the muzzle flashes, howling not in rage, but in defiance. One reached the wall. He leapt, drove his katana down, and was torn apart mid-air by a cannon blast. There was no heroism in the eyes of the gunners. Just a pull of the trigger, then a reload. How do you fight artillery with a katana? You don't, you simply refuse. To stop fighting, this war had long ceased to be about victory. It was a statement, one written in dying breath, that not all of Japan had sold its soul for silk and steam. Saigō's army, though shattered, fought like lions in a cage of fire. They moved by night, melted into hills, struck with sudden fury. But the government had learned. They no longer pursued glory. They pursued extinction. Entire rebel supply lines were cut. Villages suspected of helping the samurai were burned. Wounded rebels were executed without trial, and food? It ran out weeks ago. Now they ate roots, leather, grass, pride, yet within this suffering bloomed something the Meiji army could not calculate resolve, the kind that cannot be trained or taught, the kind that lives in stories, in blood, in duty passed down from father to son. A young rebel, barely 16, wrote in his final letter, "I do not fear death, but I fear a Japan where honor is mocked. If my sword cannot stop this future, then let my death remind it." One shell at a time, the samurai were erased. But with each death, their myth grew. Like cherry blossoms crushed into the earth, they released their beauty only when broken. Saigō watched all this from the rear lines, his eyes sunken but alight. He gave no grand speeches. He simply walked among the dying, bowed to the dead, and carried their silence. He knew what was coming. The war was not winnable, but it was necessary not to preserve power, but to preserve a memory. A line in history, unbroken until this moment, and as the artillery boomed once more, shaking the hills and silencing the birds, a single truth rang louder than any cannon. A shell can destroy a body, but only surrender can destroy a spirit. And, the samurai did not surrender. Asterisk, asterisk, beneath the gunpowder skies and shattered trees, words survived where bodies did not. Hidden in the folds of blood-stained robes, tucked beneath armor plates, scribbled on scraps of rice paper letters. Not for strategy, not for history, but for love, for memory. For the future that would never know them, these were the final voices of a dying world. To my father, I wear your blade at my side, though I fear I will shame it. The enemy has guns. We have hunger, yet when I see Saigō-sama ride past, I remember why I stayed. Not for victory, but for you? For what you taught me, that there are things worse than death, dishonor, silence, forgetting who we are. In the chaos of battle, these notes were written in candlelight, or carved into wood, or memorized by comrades in case the writer never rose again. They were offerings to the ancestors, confessions to mothers, warnings to sons. One warrior, aged only 17, wrote a farewell to a girl he'd never see again. If you still walk the cherry lanes of Satsuma, smile once for me. I will not return. But I dream of your voice louder than the cannon. That is how I fight, not for the emperor, but for the sound of your laugh in spring. Another entry, hastily written in the margin of a field manual, simply read, "They say we will die tomorrow." I believe them. But if we are to die, then let the world say we died like men. The letters are not filled with rage. Not even politics? Instead, they echo with resignation and grace? These men were not fools. They knew the tide had turned. The world belonged to steel, rails, and factories now. But they marched into oblivion with eyes open. A dying samurai passed his note to a passing medic. "Tell my son I did not die for victory. I died so that he would know we tried, that we did not kneel." Historians later found bundles of these writings in abandoned campsites, clutched in frozen hands, or buried in shallow graves. Together, they form a mosaic of a lost generation men, who stood on the shore while the ocean of modernity swallowed everything they loved. But within these letters, there is no bitterness, only clarity. They did not fear death. They feared a Japan without memory. In one final line, a captain wrote, "They call us rebels. Maybe we are. But rebels remember. Rebels remind. When the world forgets itself, it is the rebel who dies with his eyes open." And so the army fell, but not in silence. Their guns went quiet, their swords shattered. But their words remain, not as orders, not as history, but as proof that once men fought not to win, but to mean. The fires of the Satsuma Rebellion lit up the southern sky, but in Tokyo, the imperial palace stood still, its walls high, its windows closed, its heart unreadable. Saigō Takamori, once the sword of the emperor, now stood in open revolt. And yet no word came from the throne, no decree, no speech. Only silence. Not even a whisper passed from the gilded halls to the bloodied fields. Some believed the emperor grieved. Others believed he waited. But among the samurai, a darker thought spread like smoke, that this silence was not weakness, but strategy. That His Majesty, cloaked in divine mystery, had already chosen modernity and let the rebellion burn for his convenience. To the rebels, that silence felt like betrayal. Saigō had fought under the emperor's banner, bled for his rise, crushed the shogunate in the name of imperial unity. But now, as trains brought government troops southward, and telegrams flashed orders across the nation, it was clear the empire had outgrown its warriors. Still, the emperor said nothing. In Kagoshima, the rebels waited for a pardon that would never come. "He will understand," they told each other. He must. But days passed, then weeks. The answer came not in words, but in bullets. At court, advisors urged restraint, but only to protect the emperor's image. Behind closed doors, they labeled Saigō a traitor, a relic, an obstruction to progress. The Meiji government had no room for those who still bowed to Bushido more than bureaucracy. Even as government forces advanced with Gatling guns and field artillery, the emperor remained absent. His name was invoked in orders, his portrait carried into battle, but the man himself said nothing. He did not weep for the fallen. He did not defend his old friend. He simply vanished into the smoke of politics. And perhaps that was the final lesson of Saigō's life. That loyalty to the throne meant nothing if the throne had no soul. In one of the last letters recovered from Saigō's camp, a soldier wrote, "If His Majesty had only spoken, we would have laid down our arms. But from silence, we heard only abandonment. A samurai cannot serve a shadow." The emperor's silence broke something deeper than bone. It fractured faith, not just in government, not just in victory, but in the very idea of Japan itself. What is a nation if it forgets its heart? What is a ruler if he rules through absence? The silence was not empty, it echoed. And it killed more than bullets ever could. The hills of Shiroyama stood like broken teeth beneath the September sky, the last redoubt, the final wound. Here the Satsuma Rebellion would bleed its final drop. Now, the rebellion was no longer a war, it was a dirge. Saigō's men, once thousands strong, were reduced to a few hundred gaunt warriors wrapped in tattered uniforms and bound by duty alone. Their ammunition was nearly gone, their rice stores exhausted, and the imperial army had surrounded them on all sides. Yet still they waited, not for victory, not for mercy, But for meaning, Saigō Takamori sat quietly beneath a pine, gazing over the valley. His body bore the marks of fatigue, but his eyes were calm. He had not fled, even when others begged him to vanish into the forests. This rebellion had never been about winning, it had been about dying the right way. To fall for honor, he once said, is the duty of those born to the sword. Around him, the last of the samurai prepared for death like priests dressing for a final ritual. Their blades were sharpened, their armor fastened, their letters to loved ones tied with trembling hands. There were no illusions now. The future belonged to iron, to railways, to rifles. The past would end here with them. On the night of September 23, 1877, the Imperial Army fired 60,000 rounds into the mountain. Artillery lit the sky red, trees cracked like bones. Rocks split, bodies scattered, but the rebels held. They returned fire with what few bullets remained, then with swords, and finally with silence. At dawn, they charged. Saigō led them, bleeding, limping, eyes fierce. He wore no helmet. He carried no shield. Only his blade, and the belief that death in battle was the final truth of a warrior's life. Down the slope they went into the teeth of modern warfare. Gatling guns tore through their ranks. Explosions split the air, but they did not falter. They charged as if time itself could be turned back by courage alone. By mid-morning, it was over. Saigō was found beneath a tree, a bullet through his hip, another through his chest. He could not walk, but he would not be captured. Legend says a loyal retainer helped him perform seppuku, a final act of honor in a dishonored age. Some say he simply died of his wounds. It doesn't matter. What mattered was this: he died on his terms with his sword. Facing forward, the imperial troops advanced cautiously over the blood-streaked hill. They found no fanatics, no savages, only warriors who had chosen extinction over compromise. A government officer, upon surveying the scene, reportedly said, "They died for a Japan that no longer exists." But that wasn't quite true, because something eternal had passed through Shiroyama that day, something that progress could not bury, the soul of Bushido, carried to its grave by men who refused to forget. The rebellion had failed. The samurai were dead. The empire had won, but Japan would never again be whole. Not truly, for on that mountain, beneath gunpowder skies and crimson leaves, the old Japan had died not in shame, but in defiance. And though the rifles silenced the swords, the silence that followed still echoes, still haunts, still asks, what does it cost to become modern? And was the price too high? The mountain was quiet, but not peaceful. The morning mist curled like ghosts around the rocks, as if the ancestors themselves had come to witness the end. Atop Shiroyama, 500 samurai stood tired, wounded, but unyielding. Below, a modern army of 30,000 imperial troops gathered with Gatling guns and artillery. The final battle was not a question of victory. It was a question of dignity. Saigō Takamori stood at the ridge, wrapped in the silence of fate. His face was gaunt, his beard streaked with ash and exhaustion. Around him, the men who had followed him through fire and betrayal now prepared for death. They tied white hachimaki around their foreheads, a warrior's final vow. There would be no retreat, no surrender. This was the last stand of the old Japan. The night before, they had watched the stars together, speaking softly of family, of honor, of the world they once knew. One young samurai, barely 17, wept silently as he sharpened his blade. Another passed a flask of sake, whispering prayers to ancestors long gone. There was no illusion now. They knew what waited with the dawn. Saigō had received word. The emperor's forces would attack at first light. He knew the numbers, he knew the odds. He also knew he could not run. This was not about strategy anymore. It was about the soul of Bushido. Below the mountain, General Yamagata Aritomo readied his troops. Artillery units set positions, infantry tightened formations. The Gatling guns, terrible new machines of metal and flame, were loaded and aimed. The generals knew they were ending something older than memory. This, one of them whispered, is how the past dies. At sunrise, the mountain exploded. Artillery shells shrieked through the air. Trees splintered, rocks shattered. Bodies flung backward like dolls, but the samurai did not run. From the smoke they charged. Katana in hand, they moved like ghosts through the chaos, screaming the last cries of a dying era. One by one they fell, but they did not fall afraid. They fell in the name of something larger than themselves, a code, a memory, a way of life carved into their bones. A young lieutenant named Beppu Shensuke stayed close to Saigō. "We are surrounded," he said, his voice calm. Saigō looked toward the sea, where the sun painted the waves with fire. "Then we die well." By mid-morning, the samurai had been pushed to the inner ridge. Blood ran through the dirt like veins. Ammunition was gone. Only swords remained. They fought hand-to-hand steel against rifles, spirit against gunpowder. Saigō was hit. A bullet tore into his hip. Then another shattered his leg. Beppu caught him as he fell. The general of generals, once feared and adored across Japan, lay broken in the dirt, but his eyes were still clear. "It ends here," he whispered, not in surrender, but in silence. There are two stories of what happened next. One says Beppu helped him commit seppuku ritual suicide to preserve honor. Another claims Saigō died from his wounds before he could lift the blade. Both end the same. The soul of the samurai died that morning. By noon, it was over. The last of Saigō's warriors were gunned down as they charged into fire. Not a single one surrendered. The imperial soldiers, many of them once samurai themselves, stood in silence as they surveyed the carnage. The mountain reeked of smoke, blood, and something deeper, the death of an age. General Yamagata walked among the bodies. When he reached Saigō's corpse, he bowed. He ordered that the body be treated with honor. "We have killed a rebel," he said, "but we must bury a hero." Shiroyama was no longer a mountain. It was a tombstone dot from the ashes of that ridge. Japan moved on. It became factories, railways, suits, and steel. But something stayed behind, buried beneath the earth of Shiroyama. A memory, a warning, a whisper. Progress has a price. And sometimes the future demands a sacrifice so great it silences the past forever. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the slopes of Shiroyama when a strange silence fell over the mountain. No cannon fire, no screams. Only the crows circling above, waiting for what remained. Beneath the earth, soaked in blood, the last of the samurai lay broken, but not bowed. And somewhere in that silence, half memory, half myth, Saigō Takamori fell. Some say it was a bullet that took him, piercing the lower body and forcing him to collapse beside his few remaining comrades. Others say that, true to Bushido, he begged a loyal retainer to finish the act with a sword after he had delivered the fatal wound himself. In truth, no one knows. The imperial army never found his severed head, but the body was there, cold, lifeless, face up to the sky. The man who once stood as the soul of Japan, who walked the line between rebellion and honor, lay dead at 49. His death was not just the end of a life. It was the closing act of an entire civilization. General Yamagata Aritomo, overseeing the imperial side, stood among the scattered corpses and breathed a strange kind of grief. He had defeated the greatest general of his time, not with respect, but with rifles. Not in single combat, but in a war of extinction. Even he, a servant of modern Japan, could not help but whisper, "We have killed something greater than a man." The government declared victory. Tokyo cheered. The Meiji emperor remained silent, but not everyone celebrated. Across the islands, whispers spread Saigō had died with dignity. That he remained loyal, even in rebellion. That he represented something purer than politics, older than progress. In death he became a symbol too powerful to erase. Mothers told stories of him to their children. Artists painted his likeness not as a rebel, but as a tragic hero. In Satsuma, shrines were erected in his honor. And decades later, the emperor himself would grant him a posthumous pardon. A nation that had executed its soul now sought forgiveness from its ghost. And what of the code the samurai way? It too lay buried on Shiroyama. The katana gave way to the rifle, honor gave way to efficiency. The call of duty became bureaucracy. Japan would go on to become an empire of its own, modern, industrial, imperial. But it would never again be What it was, Saigō Takamori's death, marked more than the end of a rebellion. It marked the death of the samurai. And like all great deaths, it left behind a silence that echoed longer than any war drum. No monument can fully capture what died. That day, it was not just a man or even a class of warriors, it was a way of being. A belief that there are things worth dying for, even when the world calls them outdated. In the misty dawn of Shiroyama, a bow was made not to an emperor, not to victory, but to honor itself. The final bow. And then silence. The smoke had cleared, the swords had fallen. The blood had dried into the soil of Shiroyama, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was vacancy. In the aftermath of the rebellion, Japan did not pause to mourn. It moved forward with mechanical precision like a locomotive thundering through the ashes of a shrine. Railroads expanded. Telegraph wires stitched the islands together. Western uniforms paraded in Tokyo, and behind every gleaming innovation, something older and sacred disappeared. The samurai were no longer needed. Their stipends were gone, their swords outlawed. Their topknots, symbols of their caste, were mocked in public. Those who had once been honored for dying with dignity were now laughed at for failing to adapt. 1,000 years of warrior tradition, erased in a single generation. In schoolhouses built by foreign architects, children no longer recited Bushido. They learned English, chemistry, and the arithmetic of commerce. Loyalty was no longer to clan or code but to bureaucracy and the bottom line. Even the language changed. The poetry of the past replaced with the prose of progress. Tokyo, once Edo, became a metropolis of ambition. Brick by brick, it buried the old Japan under new architecture. Gaslights replaced lanterns, police badges replaced swords. Honor was no longer found in action, but in paperwork. The samurai, if they survived, became clerks, and yet underneath the steel and steam something was missing. The people felt it, even if they could not name it. It was in the way the elderly gazed toward the mountains as if searching for ghosts, in the way old songs still haunted the lips of drunk men in alleyways, in the temples where monks chanted for souls who died not just in battle, but in spirit. The emperor, untouched by the bloodshed, said nothing. He had led Japan to victory, but at the cost of its essence. He wore Western suits now, sat on Western thrones, spoke with Western advisors. His silence was not just political, it was cultural. As if he too knew that something had been lost which no government decree could restore. General Yamagata, who had once overseen the death of Saigō, would go on to build Japan's modern military. He crafted it in the mold of Prussia, efficient, obedient, deadly. But even he, in his later writings, confessed a strange regret. "We gained a nation," he wrote, "but lost a people." Japan became an empire. It would conquer, colonize, and one day fall to fire and ash. But the wound left by Shiroyama never healed. It scarred the national psyche, a reminder that beneath the engines of progress, there had once been soul. In time, Saigō Takamori was enshrined as a folk hero. Statues rose where once his enemies stood. His rebellion, once condemned, was reinterpreted as noble, but it was too late. You cannot resurrect a code. You can only remember it to ache. The modern world marched on, faster and louder, until the silence of the samurai became a whisper beneath the clatter of trains, a whisper beneath the glass towers, a whisper in the hearts of those who still believe that a nation without its soul is not a nation at all. And so, Japan lived, but something else had died, something that could not be rebuilt with steel or resurrected with glory. Not a man, not a class, not even a culture, a soul, and once a soul is gone, only memory remains. He died in silence, but his memory would not. Saigō Takamori, the rebel, the loyalist, the man who dared to defy the emperor, should have been erased from history. That was the plan. Let his death be quiet. Let his name dissolve into ash, like all defeated men. But instead, something strange happened. The more Japan tried to forget him, the more it remembered. It began in whispers, in the sobs of mothers from Satsuma who had lost their sons at Shiroyama, in the drunken ballads sung late at night when soldiers clutched their cups and wept for a Japan that no longer existed. Then came the stories half truth, half prayer. They said Saigō did not die by bullet or blade, but vanished into the mountains, waiting to return when Japan needed him most. They said he spoke to the gods before his final charge, that his sword, still stained with the blood of betrayal, lay hidden beneath the cherry trees of Kagoshima, that on quiet nights you could hear his voice riding on the wind, honor above all. Children grew up with his name on their lips, artists carved his image from stone, poets bled his tragedy into ink. And in 1898, just 2 decades after his rebellion, the Meiji government, those who once condemned him, commissioned a statue at Rose in Ueno Park, Tokyo, not far from where the imperial elite now walked their western dogs and drank imported coffee. Cast in bronze, Saigō stood not as a rebel, not even as a general, but as a man of peace walking his loyal dog, dressed in humble kimono, no sword, no fire in his eyes, just calm dignity. A lie made beautiful, the statue was more than metal. It was an admission that Japan had killed its soul, but it could not bear to forget it. Even the emperor silent during Saigō's fall granted him a posthumous pardon. He was misguided, they said, but noble. And in that contradiction, a legend was born. The man they once feared became the man they longed for. In an age of factories and ledgers, Saigō became a symbol of something unmeasurable: honor, sacrifice, and unyielding spirit. He became myth not because of what he achieved, but because of what he represented. A Japan not yet tamed by modernity. A Japan that still believed in right over rule. Across generations, the myth only grew. During the wars of the 20th century, soldiers carried his image into battle, believing he watched over them. Filmmakers told his story with sweeping violins and tearful final scenes. Even the West grew fascinated. To them, Saigō was Japan mysterious. Tragic, noble in defeat, but legends are dangerous things. They can inspire, they can comfort, but they can also blind. The real Saigō was complex, at times ruthless, conflicted, even misguided, but the myth erased all that. It made him pure, untouchable, and in doing so, Japan did not just honor its past. It rewrote it. Still, the bronze in Ueno Park remains. It endures earthquakes and typhoons. Tourists take photos beneath it, unaware they stand in the shadow of a paradox, for Saigō Takamori was no longer just a man. He was memory, he was myth, he was the ghost of a time when the sword still had meaning. And as long as that statue stands, as long as stories are told by candlelight to children with wide eyes, the samurai will never fully die. They will ride. Again, not in flesh, but in spirit, and somewhere in the stillness between tradition and progress, Saigō waits not to return, but to remind. The machines roared, but beneath their clatter, something older whispered. Japan was changing. Concrete replaced cobblestone. Telegraph lines webbed across the sky like veins of a new artificial god. Locomotives screamed through valleys once, reserved for monks and fox spirits. From the outside, the empire gleamed modern, ordered, reborn. But deep inside its steel heart, something refused to die. It was the ghost of the samurai. He lived not in armor, but in memory. Not in the clang of swords, but in the silences between progress. His presence haunted the nation like incense lingering in a burned-out temple. No longer seen, but never fully gone. In the new army barracks of Tokyo, young recruits trained with rifles and wore European uniforms, yet still bowed with the discipline of Bushido. Their sergeants barked in clipped commands, but their oaths whispered. Before sleep echoed the same vows made centuries before: duty, loyalty, sacrifice. Officers read Saigō's biography like scripture. They underlined his final words. It is shameful to live, he had once written, when one's nation is dying. Some would carry those words into the trenches of Manchuria, into the jungles of Burma, into the suicide plains over the Pacific. The ghost spoke through them. In politics too, the echo persisted. Leaders evoked the spirit of Yamato, claiming to restore what the West had nearly extinguished. Parliaments and cabinets might dress in suits, but they carried the ancient hunger for honor, for absolutes. A century after Saigō's death, prime ministers still quoted his defiance, not because it was wise, but because it was eternal. And in the home, In the hearts of the people, the ghost lingered most of all. Fathers who never knew war told their sons to stand tall like the samurai. Mothers, tucking children into futons, whispered old war songs as lullabies. In Satsuma, where the soil still remembered the blood of Shiroyama, elders left offerings at local shrines not for gods, but for warriors, but the ghost could not be controlled. Sometimes it turned dark. Fanatics twisted Bushido into fanaticism. Pride became cruelty, and what had once been a code of balance was reshaped into a weapon of empire. In the 1930s and 40s, the world would come to know a new Japan, one that remembered Saigō's sacrifice but forgot his sorrow. Kamikaze pilots wore white headbands invoking the samurai spirit, yet their war was not noble, it was madness wrapped in memory. The ghost had been summoned but not understood, and so, in time, the machines won. They always do. The war ended. In mushroom clouds. Cities burned hotter than any forge of old. When the smoke cleared, the emperor no longer spoke as a god. Japan bowed again, but this time to survival. Still, the ghost remains, not in fire, not in blade, but in the quiet rituals of a fading people. In the cherry blossoms that fall each spring, fragile and brief. In the art of the bow, the calligraphy of regret, the shrine beside the highway. In the refusal to forget. Saigō Takamori was gone, his rebellion crushed, his code disbanded. But in every corner of modern Japan, where someone chooses dignity over gain, where someone dares to act on principle rather than convenience, he lives. The machines hum louder than ever now. But listen closely, and you may still hear the footfall of sandals in the shadows, not a man, a ghost, waiting not to return, but to remind, ****, it did not die, it was rewritten. What began as a code of honor, forged by steel and sacrifice, slowly warped into something else, obedience without question. The spirit of Bushido, once tethered to loyalty, compassion, and death with dignity, was hollowed out by the rising ambitions of the state. And in its place a new weapon was born, not made of iron or gunpowder, but of ideology. In the early 20th century, the Meiji government, now fully industrialized, militarized, and imperial, found itself in need of more than soldiers. It needed believers, fanatics, men who would march into the flames, not just for victory, but for something they believed was sacred. Bushido became the gospel. State scholars rewrote the ancient codes, stripping them of nuance. Loyalty was emphasized above thought, above family, above life itself. The teachings of Yamaga-sake and Nitobe Inazu were reduced to state slogans. Where once Bushido had cautioned against blind rage and cruel war, now it was taught as the very essence of nationalism. In schools, children no longer studied history, they studied myth. They bowed not to the teachings of Confucius or the writings of Saigō Takamori, but to images of the emperor now divine. Textbooks recast the Satsuma rebellion not as a tragedy, but as an example of total loyalty, conveniently forgetting that Saigō had rebelled against the government for betraying the spirit of Japan. In this twisted retelling, the traitor became the model. By the 1930s, Bushido had become institutionalized. Officers in the Imperial Japanese Army wore swords not out of tradition but as a reminder of expected sacrifice. Orders were no longer debated. Suicide, once a deeply personal act of atonement, became a tactic. Whole units were taught to die, with smiles on their faces, believing it was the highest form of loyalty. They were told Saigō would have done the same, but Saigō's rebellion had been one of conscience, not blind obedience. His was a war against power that had lost its soul. The new Bushido, mechanized, politicized, weaponized, had no room for that kind of defiance. It called for conformity, not conviction. In 1944, a teenage kamikaze pilot named Yukio Araki wrote to his mother, "Please find joy in your son's sacrifice for the emperor." He had been taught that death was not only noble, but expected. The state had forged a generation of living ghosts, marching toward fire with smiles stitched onto their skulls. The echo of Shiroyama rang louder than ever, but it was distorted. Bushido was no longer about facing death for honor. It was about requiring it. In this new world, Silence was loyalty. Thought was treason. And those who dared to question the myth were left behind forgotten or punished. The empire expanded into China, into Korea, into Southeast Asia, and with it marched the ghost of Bushido, now twisted into a mask for cruelty, and then came Hiroshima, Nagasaki. The emperor's voice, heard for the first time, was not divine, it was broken. The silence that followed was not noble, it was empty dot in the ashes of war. Japan would again try to make sense of what it had become. The code of the samurai, co-opted, exploited, and corrupted, was left behind like a torn banner in a storm. No one quite knew what to do with it, but history remembers Bushido, in its true form, was not about war. It was about how one faces death, yes, but more so, how one lives with purpose. The state had used its shadow but lost its substance, and so what remained was neither sword nor scroll, but a question. When honor is rewritten to serve power, does it still belong to the people, or has it become just another chain? History loves symbols. It paints them in bold strokes, hero or traitor, loyalist or rebel. But Saigō Takamori was never a man who fit cleanly into such frames. He was a paradox, a patriot who rebelled, a modernizer who died defending the old ways. And in the quiet aftermath of war, when the smoke and blood had faded, one question still lingered. What had he truly fought for? Not against progress, not against modernity, but against the way it was being forced upon a people who weren't ready. Saigō did not despise the train or the telegraph, but he feared what came with them, the loss of soul, the loss of dignity, the replacement of Bushido with bureaucracy, the transformation of samurai into salarymen, warriors into clerks. He watched as men who had once bowed to emperors out of honor now bowed to ministers out of fear. He watched the youth, once raised on discipline and duty, now ridiculed the very traditions that forged them. He saw the heart of Japan being replaced with the machinery of empire, and he could not stay silent. That is why he rode to war, not to turn back the clock, but to ask the question no one dared utter aloud. Must progress always come at the price of the soul? When the Satsuma warriors took up their swords, they knew they would lose. They were not fools. They saw the rifles, the artillery, the trained imperial troops marching in rows. But to them, this was never a war of victory. It was a war of memory, of meaning. It was a statement written in blood. We were here, we mattered. And we will not go quietly. In Saigō's final days, those closest to him said he often looked distant, not just from pain, but from the weight of his convictions. He had raised his blade against the very government he helped create. The same emperor he'd once served in loyalty now stood silently behind the rifles that would kill him. He did not curse the emperor. He did not regret the Meiji Restoration. But he did regret what it had become, and in that regret, there was something beautiful, because Saigō understood what most leaders forget, that the strength of a nation is not measured in steel or speed, but in the spirit of its people. He fought, not to preserve feudalism, but to protect the dignity that once lived within it. He believed the samurai were not defined by their swords, but by their sacrifice, their honor, their devotion to something greater than themselves. When that was stripped away, he saw nothing left worth obeying, and so he chose rebellion not out of ambition, but out of conscience. That is what separates him from the tyrants and warlords of history. Saigō was not a man of power, but of principle. His fight was not to dominate, but to remind Japan what it once believed in. Even as modernity crashed over the islands like a tidal wave, he stood, knee-deep in tradition, holding the line not for victory, but for memory. Even in death he made his stand, and Japan remembered, not immediately, not officially, but slowly, like a flower blooming from ash. His name was whispered in reverence, his image carved in stone. Even the emperor, decades later, would issue a pardon not just for political reasons, but because the people demanded it. They knew deep down that this man had not betrayed Japan. He had tried to save its soul. What Saigō really fought for cannot be found in textbooks or museums. It lives in the quiet moments, when a man chooses duty over gain, when a woman honors tradition without becoming its prisoner, when a nation asks itself not just how to move forward, But why? He fought to remind the world that in the rush toward tomorrow, we must not forget who we were yesterday, not to hold us back, but to keep. ****, the battlefield was silent. Years had passed since the blood dried on the slopes of Shiroyama, but Japan had not forgotten, nor had the world. In the quiet ripples of history, Saigō Takamori's final stand became more than a rebellion, it became a parable. Empires rise. Empires fall, flags change, borders shift. But some things are not buried by time. A lesson of the samurai was never about war. It was about something far older, far deeper. It was about honor. The Meiji government would go on to reshape Japan into a global power. Railways stitched cities together. Factories roared with ambition. Education reformed, armies modernized, industries bloomed. But in the cracks between progress, the spirit of a vanished era still flickered. Not as nostalgia, but as warning for all its rifles and reason. Modern Japan had learned something ancient at Shiroyama. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill what he dies for. Saigō had not merely fought a government. He had not just led samurai to slaughter. He had carved into history a wound that would not close, a mark that said, "There is a cost to forgetting who you are." In every future war Japan waged, from the Sino-Japanese campaigns to the Pacific, theater generals would whisper his name. His statue, standing in Ueno Park, became a quiet teacher to 1,000 generations. Tourists would admire his calm expression, unaware that beneath his bronze stillness lay 1,000 screams, silenced by progress. And perhaps that was the lesson all along, that the greatest revolutions are not those that topple regimes, but those that awaken the soul. Saigō Takamori had no illusions. He knew he could not stop time, but he believed with every breath that if a man stood for something pure, truly pure, then even in death he could teach. And so he taught, not through speeches, not through victories, but through the impossible choice to die with dignity, rather than live without meaning. The samurai code may have fallen. The sword may have dulled. But what Saigō left behind was something no empire, no emperor, no bullet could destroy. The belief that honor still matters, that a man can lose everything and still keep himself, that to die standing for your truth is better than to live kneeling for a lie. In the centuries that followed, Japan would wrestle with that legacy, sometimes honoring it, sometimes distorting it, but never forgetting it. Because when the wind howls through the mountains of Kagoshima, and the mist gathers over Shiroyama, there is still a presence in the silence, not a ghost, not a memory, but a lesson, the samurai's last lesson, and it speaks without words. The body may fall. The soul does not.